Good afternoon, everybody. We're just waiting a few moments for people to join us, but welcome to Put Your Money Where Your Heart Is, our joint event between Shared Interest and ECCR. I can just see that there's a few more people joining us from the waiting room, so we'll just wait a moment or two before we make a start. So just as we're welcoming a few more participants, welcome to Put Your Money Where Your Heart Is, our joint event between Shared Interest and ECCR. We'll make a start in a moment. So we seem to have a number of attendees joined us, so we'll make a start, and others joining will be able to join in as and when they can. So welcome. Thank you for joining us for our joint event, as I mentioned, between Shared Interest and ECCR on the topic of ethical finance and how money can make change. My name is Sally Seddon, and I'm the Volunteer Engagement Manager with Shared Interest. This event falls in the second week of Fairtrade Fortnight. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this annual event, I would encourage you to check out the Fairtrade Foundation's website to see what else is going on over these 2 weeks. We'll have some more information about that at the end of our presentation, so don't worry if you need some signposting to where you'll find that information. We are recording today's session, and it will be shared on our website and also on the Fairtrade Foundation's website, where they'll be hosting an on-demand section of Fairtrade Fortnight, where people can go back and rewatch sessions that have been held during the fortnight. So we'll have 2 presentations this morning, followed by a Q&A. And before I introduce our speakers, just a little bit of the practicalities of the Q&A. We are using Zoom, obviously, to host this session, and there is a Q&A function as part of this webinar. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen. If you drag your mouse, your cursor to the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little Q&A box that has 2 speech bubbles. If you click on that button, and then you can type in your question, and please ask your questions at any point during the session. We will address questions and answers at the end of the presentations though, but feel free to submit your questions for either any of the speakers, either organisation at any time through the sessions. Also, just to say that although our speakers will be talking about ethical finance, we're not here to give financial advice. We're simply sharing information about our organisations. So to introduce our speakers, we have Rosie Venner, Money Makes Change Programme Manager with ECCR. Rosie will be speaking about their Green Your Money campaign and a recently launched ethical buying guide that supports churches wanting to develop an ethical purchasing policy. Following Rosie will be Mike and Ruth Holmes, ambassadors with Shared Interest, and they will be talking about their own involvement with Shared Interest and how finance from Shared Interest is supporting fair trade businesses around the world. So that's it from me, and I'm now going to pass over to Rosie to get us started.
Thanks so much, Sally, for that introduction. Let me just share my slides. So I thought I would set the scene a little bit before we hear some inspiring stories from Shared Interest's work. What does it mean to put your money where your heart is? I think those of us who are passionate about the fair trade movements and its impact, we think carefully about the products that we buy. But how can we put fairness and justice and sustainability at the heart of all of our financial decisions, not just our consumer choices? What does our choice of bank or where we choose to save and invest say about our values? And that's the bigger picture I want to explore briefly today. What role can we play as individuals? What role can we play with the collective resources that we have, for example, through our churches or institutions? For those who aren't familiar with ECCR's work, just a summary there on the screen about the work that we do in our vision of a world where money is used to shape a fairer, greener future. I should say at this point that although ECCR and our Money Makes Change programme is primarily aimed at Christians, hopefully what I share today will be relevant whether you belong to a faith community or not. Let's think for a moment about the context in which we make financial choices, where we spend, where we bank, where we invest. This feels like a really crucial time to be looking at how we use and steward our money in the broadest possible sense, not just because it's Fairtrade Fortnight, but because all around us in the news headlines and world events, we see the role of finance. We need finance to help solve some of the biggest problems that we face as a global community. But so often, money is used to shore up inequality and imbalances of power, concentrating wealth amongst the few, or benefiting a handful of shareholders while causing harm to people and planet. Just this week, the world's leading climate scientists, the IPCC, released their latest report on the climate crisis. I don't know if you've had a chance to read any of it, even just to read some of the headlines, but it's pretty shocking reading. It's a reminder, if we needed it, that half the world's population live in areas highly vulnerable to climate change. Fair trade farmers and producers are at risk right now, not in some distant future. So we need to listen to what they're calling for. Those who've done least to cause the climate crisis shouldn't be facing the financial burden. All of this is in the context of the pandemic, and that has increased inequality and is going to take a very long time for people to recover their resilience and to adapt to the challenges that they face in the coming years. We've also seen just this week that money can be a tool for change and a way of speaking out on the issues that concern us. In the context of the war in Ukraine, the Church of England has recently ditched its £20 million of investments in Russian companies, and major pension funds in the UK are starting to do the same. So just as we can take a stand with where we spend money, we can also speak out through where we invest money, choosing when to divest, when to move our money out of things that cause harm, where to engage and where to seek positive impact. So our context, what's going on in the world around us, can motivate us to act differently with our finances. You may be motivated by some of these concerns and other things that are close to your heart. But we're also driven by our values, by a desire to align the choices that we make with our values and our hope for a better world. In another workshop I ran recently, I asked people to name some of those values, some of the values that drive their decision-making with money. And these are some of the things that people came up with. I wonder what values stand out for you. What are the values that motivate you? Perhaps it's justice, perhaps it's equality, perhaps it's wealth sharing, perhaps it's sustainability. This is a quote I often hear in the context of choosing fair trade products. Every time you spend money, you're casting a vote for the kind of world you want. And I want us to think a little bit more broadly than that today. I would expand that to say it's not just about what we spend, but about our whole financial footprint. And what do I mean by our financial footprint? You're probably familiar with the idea of a carbon footprint, where we measure our impact through carbon emissions. But what thought have you given to your wider financial footprint? What impact do our decisions around money have on the world? Do we tread lightly on the earth with those decisions? What impact do we leave for future generations? Do we use our money to stand in solidarity with others? There are lots of ways of thinking about this, and unlike with a carbon footprint, there are no technical calculations that you can do. It's more a tool for reflection. So this is an exercise that you might like to do in your own time, or if you're listening to the recording, you could pause and do this now. To take a pen and paper and jot down all the decisions you make with money, what you know about what your money is doing and what you don't know. Most of us don't think of ourselves as investors, but if we have a workplace or a private pension, we're investors. If we've got some money in a savings account, potentially we could be investors, whether that's £5, £50, £5,000. And remember that the money that's in your bank accounts or in your pension is not just sitting there. Banks lend to and finance companies around the world, and your pension provider is investing money in global funds, most likely in sectors like fossil fuels, mining, and big tech companies. If you haven't purposely chosen an ethical bank or pension fund or investment, it's likely that your money is being used for things that are at odds with your values and not consistent with the kind of world that you want to see. And you could do the same exercise for your church. What does your financial footprint look like? And what you might find is that while you try to make clear ethical choices with your spending, like choosing Fairtrade products, you may have paid less attention to the positive choices you can make with the rest of your finances. And why does all this matter? We've talked a little bit about the global context already, about the climate crisis and about deepening inequality. But just to put it in very simple terms, most of the money that we invest and a good proportion of the money that we spend ends up with large companies. And some of those companies can cause harm by employing people in unfair or unsafe working conditions, contributing to climate change, or destroying natural habitats. Other companies may be tackling global challenges through the goods and services they provide. They might be contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. Perhaps they use their raw materials sustainably, provide decent, fairly paid work that lifts people out of poverty, or are involved in renewable energy projects. We need more finance to flow in the direction of companies that are committed to shaping a fairer, more sustainable world, whether that's a large multinational or a small social enterprise. And the good news is that there is a lot that you can do. And in a moment, Shared Interest volunteers will be giving a really practical example of what that looks like. But I thought I'd run through a few general principles and resources and ideas for action first. Firstly, on banking. One thing you can do is just to find out what your bank invests in. Sometimes that's easier to do, and sometimes it's difficult because they're not particularly transparent about that. But there are some tools out there that can help you. Bank Green is a really useful tool for checking your bank's involvement in fossil fuels. An Ethical Consumer has some really useful guides if you're thinking about switching to a more ethical bank. Other parts of the world are actually doing much better than we are in the UK in terms of having purpose-driven banks, banks that are really shaping a fairer and more sustainable world. So if you want some inspiration, I would look to the Global Alliance for Banking on Values and see what's happening around the world and the exciting work that's going on in changing the banking system, making credit more accessible to people, making financial services more accessible to marginalised communities, and investing and financing things that are really going to make a difference, the practical solutions that we need. If we look at pensions, that's a little bit more complex, and I think people are quite daunted to start looking at their pension. I'm only just going to briefly touch on this now and point you towards some useful resources. There's a huge amount of money in pensions. There's 2.6 trillion or 2.7 trillion possibly now in UK pensions. I'm not quite sure which is the right amount at the moment. But it's a large sum of money. That's just in the UK pensions. I rarely hear people talk about pensions, and yet for most of us, it will be the biggest investment decision of our lifetime. The vast majority of people, about 90% of people who are automatically enrolled into a pension fund, stay in the fund that they're first put in. That's what's called the default fund. And it will most likely be invested in the FTSE 100. So big companies like Shell and BP, some of the big mining companies. The organisation Share Action says it's possible that over 10% of the average pension in the UK is invested in fossil fuel companies. So choosing a more ethical or sustainable pension or engaging with your pension provider is a really positive step that you can take, and it makes a difference. So there's some resources there on the screen that can help you, whether that's because you want to raise your voice about pensions in general and push pensions to behave better to get to net zero, or if you want to look specifically at your own pension, go to Make My Money Matter, which is a campaign that's been running for a couple of years, also Share Action and the website Good With Money, and you'll find lots of resources there to help you take some positive steps with the money that's in your pension. And finally, on other investments, this is a huge topic, not one I'm going to attempt to go into much detail now. I'm also not a financial advisor, so I'm not going to give you any recommendations of where to invest your money, but there are some questions that I can encourage you to ask about any investments that you have. Firstly, what do you want to avoid? What do you want to move money away from if you already have investments? Secondly, where can you engage? Where do you have a voice for change? If you have a share in a company, you have a say in how that company is run. You can join in with others as part of larger campaigns. You can ask questions at AGMs. You can ask any institution that you belong to speak out through their investments. And thirdly, what do you want to embrace? Where could you invest in businesses and initiatives that are good for society and the planet? That might be through a fund that has ethical criteria, or it could be a more direct investment. And you'll want to do your research and maybe find an ethical financial advisor who understands and shares your values. So that's a quick whistle-stop tour through banking and pensions investments to hopefully spark a few thoughts around where you might start to take some positive action. It's a growing movement. The movement for greener, fairer finance is growing. Just as we've seen that shift in consumer behaviour in recent years and the growth of the fair trade market, there's an increasing interest in ethical banking and investing. These things might have been seen as a niche interest just a few years ago. But a government survey in 2019 found that when presented with a choice, most people in the UK would prefer their investments to consider impact on people and the planet. In other words, most people want to invest in a better world. And there was particular high level of interest among young people. But it needs to be more mainstream. Research that was published this week estimated that there's about £58 billion in impact investment in the UK. So that's money that considers its impact on people and the planet alongside financial considerations. But that represents only 1% of investments in the UK. So we've still got a long way to go. Probably one of the biggest things you can do is to start talking about money and the choices that you make. If you're already with an ethical bank or you've chosen to switch to an ethical pension fund, talk to others about why you've made that decision. If your church is a fair trade church, tell people about it, talk about your purchasing decisions, and use that as a starting point to talk about other ethical decision making around money. We need to build a movement for fairer, greener financial decisions as individuals and as institutions. And there are so many lessons that we can learn from the fair trade movement. A few ethical choices by a few individuals is not enough. We need fundamental change. We need a mass movement that involves faith communities, schools, universities, local authorities, businesses. And importantly, it's a movement that needs to include and be driven by those who are most at risk from climate change and other injustices, because they have the knowledge of the solutions that are needed. So before I hand over to Ruth and Mike, I just wanted to share briefly about the resources that we have that can support you and your church to take action. If you go to the ECCR website, you'll see all the resources connected with our Money Makes Change programme. We have a Green Your Money campaign running at the moment, and we're encouraging people to sign up to take a step, either with their bank, their investments, their pension, or with their church spending. If you sign up to the campaign, then we'll send you regular reminders and resources, tips and prompts for action. I think often with decisions around money, we can know that we want to make a difference. We can know that we want to do something different, but actually taking that step can be challenging. So if you join us in the Green Your Money campaign, then you'll be part of a community that's doing it together and you'll get those regular prompts. We also have a Bridging the Gap quiz, which is just a really simple tool that you could maybe share with others. It helps you think through where you're already making that connection between your values and the decisions that you make with money. And it's a really quick and easy thing to just maybe spot those bits of your financial footprint that you haven't quite thought about yet. And for churches, two particular resources to point out: an ethical purchasing guide, which we produced towards the end of last year, which is a really practical toolkit for churches to help them think about their purchasing really holistically. So lots of churches obviously signed up as fair trade congregations, which is fantastic. are there other areas of your spending that you might want to consider, perhaps around the fair tax mark, or around buying from companies that pay the living wage here in the UK? So we've just produced that guide to help you think through that and put together a purchasing policy for your church. So I hope that will be helpful. We've also got an analysis of ethical bank accounts for churches. Conscious that lots of churches are wanting to take steps, particularly around their carbon footprint. And so you can take a look at that if that's something that your church would like to do, and you want to have a look at the different options available to you. Lots of other resources available on our website, but those are the ones that I wanted to highlight to you today. And I will now hand over to Ruth and Mike, who are going to share some stories from shared interest work, which I'm really looking forward to hearing about.
Thank you, Rosie. That was a really good summary of all the issues surrounding money, which, as you say, is very important to everybody. Right, I'm going to share our screen now, if I can. Shared Interest Society. Right, we'd like to introduce you now to Amma Okalogo. She's a member of the Amogataba Basket Weavers Group, which works with an organisation called Trade Aid. They are a shared interest customer. She weaves baskets in the Bolgatanga area of Ghana in West Africa. Trade Aid Integrated is a not-for-profit organisation working with 65 basket weaver groups. Due to the hot and dry climate, the land is difficult to farm, and so the majority of the population relies on handcrafts to make a living.
The impact of climate change has reduced the quality of local grown straw and, at times, makes it difficult to source. As this is the predominant raw material of the basket industry, it's a major problem. As a support service, Trade Aid provides a straw bank, buying in bulk when good quality straw becomes available and selling it to communities for a lower price.
In the past, basket weavers have been forced to sell their products to middlemen who profit from the weavers' work. Now, however, the weavers deal directly with Trade Aid, who fulfill orders from the international market and provide weavers with a fair price. Finding that many of the groups were making just one type of basket, Trade Aid also offers product diversification training, as well as business and marketing support.
Supporting 1,625 producer artisans, Trade Aid has helped the weavers form cooperatives, which has then led to partnerships with international companies such as Serve International, also a shared interest customer, who order up to 5,000 baskets each year.
In 2014, Trade Aid used shared interest finance to purchase weaving equipment and also a truck for transporting goods to the harbour, to the coast, which is extremely effective in getting baskets to where they could be sold faster. Interestingly, with the truck, they even rent it out to other people when it's not in use, so it provides a little bit of extra income. In 2017, a second loan was taken out with shared interest and allowed them to buy more tools and more equipment because they were struggling to meet the demand for their product. Just last year, Trade Aid extended their support to 199 new producers within the basket weaving community, helping them to increase production volumes and engage in farming activities during the quiet seasons.
Trade Aid has also participated in a project with Shared Interest Foundation, our charitable arm. The project supports the basket weavers to establish a vegetable farm without the use of soil. The soilless farming technique uses readily available local materials, including sawdust and rice husks, which have the ability to retain water from a sustainable source and release nutrients for the plant's growth. They are able to grow lettuce, tomatoes, peppers, aubergine, which they call garden eggs, cabbage, and local beans.
Nicholas Apokara, the Trade Aid Director, says, "The finance from shared interest gives Trade Aid the opportunity to pre-finance producers in advance. It creates an opportunity for producers to sell their baskets for a higher price than on the open market. They also get to receive payment in bulk, which helps them plan their household expenditure better."
So as you know, we're Mike and Ruth Holmes, and we're speaking to you from what is actually cloudy Lincoln at the moment. We've been involved in the fair trade movement from as long ago as 1980. We can remember visiting the first tradecraft shop in an old warehouse in Newcastle.
When we retired a few years ago, we wanted to make an investment that would help others, and shared interest was a great choice. It has its roots in the fair trade movement in the Northeast, but is an independent organisation. Since then, we have been impressed with the work of shared interest and also the enthusiasm and passion of its staff. And so we decided to become voluntary ambassadors, promoting shared interest to a wider audience.
Based in Newcastle, Shared Interest is a not-for-profit social investment fund that provides fair and just financial services to fair trade businesses in the developing world. It is the world's only 100% fair trade lender.
By pooling the investments of over 12,300 UK individuals, and with a current share capital of over £50 million, it can lend these funds to farmers and handcraft producers who buy seeds, fertilizers, and raw materials. Once they sell their crops or crafts, they pay back the loan, and this money can be lent out again. Last year, every pound was lent out 1.6 times. You can see on the slide here the sort of cyclical effect of lending out the money, receiving the money back, lending it out again. So a shared interest account is an investment that is ongoing. It is lent out time and time again.
And here you can see the impact that shared interest can make in a single year. Shared interest funds are used to help organisations improve production and increase export sales. This includes the building of warehouses, purchasing of trucks, as Mike mentioned earlier, and other essential equipment and raw materials, amongst other things.
You can see on the slide, by helping finance 175 producer groups, that's actually impacting on over 8,000 employees, but their work actually enables the farmers and artisans to earn a living, and that's 374,000 plus people. So just in a year, the collective revenue is nearly £900 million of the producer groups that shared interest is helping. So what type of lending does shared interest do? Well, obviously, in the countries in which we work, coffee producers are much the biggest share, 44%, and cocoa, as you would expect. But you can see that there is still finance going to handcrafts, like the basket weavers groups, and then a variety of other things. I think probably the most important is chocolate. I'm sure we'd all agree with that. But there's some really interesting ones. There's been some work with bees, and you can see some honey there and other things. As all the businesses that shared interest lends to are registered as fair trade, increasing production and sales simultaneously increases the amount of fair trade premium they receive on top of the basic payment for their goods. This premium enables them to invest in improving the quality of their lives, such as developing community facilities and constructing new schools and healthcare centres.
Shared Interest accepts investments from UK-based individuals, as well as from faith and community groups, schools and businesses. Account values can range from £100 to £100,000, although as a cooperative, each account has an equal share in the business. All invested funds are then pooled and used to make low-interest loans to fair trade businesses in the developing world.
It is important to point out that Shared Interest Society is not a regulated organisation, and any investment in the society is not covered by protection such as the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. The loans offered to producers are generally unsecured, so investors share the risk of any bad debts, but you can never lose more than you invest. I am pleased to say that in the 32-year history of Shared Interest, no one has lost any part of their investment.
And we'd just like to finish by showing you a short video that gives a good summary of how shared interest works.
Dave lives in the UK. He works hard, sends his children to school and goes to the doctor if he needs to. Dave drinks coffee and dreams of a fairer world. Maria lives in Peru. She works hard but cannot afford to send her children to school or go to the doctor. Maria grows coffee and dreams of a fairer world. Dave doesn't think he's rich, but he has some spare money and knows he can borrow from the bank if he needs to. Maria doesn't think she's poor, but she only gets paid once a year and has to use expensive money lenders in the months before harvest. Wouldn't it be good if Dave could lend some of his money he doesn't need right now to Maria, and she could repay him when she'd sold her coffee? In 1990, we set up a special society to make this possible. Dave and people like him in the UK put money into a share account and we lend it to Maria and people like her all over the world. It's called Shared Interest, and it's our way of investing in a fairer world. Last year we sent £48.5 million from the pooled savings of our members, that's people like Dave, to 230 fair trade organisations that include people like Maria in 51 countries across the globe. And as they repay us, we lend the money again and again and again. Dave and Maria really do have a shared interest, and you can too. With just £100, you can open a shared interest account and start investing in a fairer world.
I'll just hand back to Sally now, and I think you're putting your email address, Sally, in the chat, so that if anybody would like to get further information about shared interest and an investment pack, she'll be able to send that out to you.
Thank you very much, Mike and Ruth, and thank you very much, Rosie. I hope that both presentations have certainly been thought-provoking and very interesting to hear more about the things that we can all do, whether that as individuals or from faith communities or indeed any other organisations that any of you joining us today might be representing. Certainly lots of questions to take away and reflect upon, and indeed a number of suggestions that Rosie's made there as well of signposting us helpfully to different organisations and websites with information to help us in those reflections and indeed any conversations and dialogue that might come from those. So just a reminder to those of you joining us to please send through any questions that you might have for Rosie, Mike or Ruth, or indeed myself, through the Q&A function. Just as we give you a moment or two perhaps to reflect and pose your questions, a couple of things that I will pose to you, and once I've asked these questions, then indeed I will pop some details in the chat for those of you watching to have access to websites and some email addresses to get in touch with both Shared Interest and ECCR. So I think probably the first question is for yourself, Rosie, one for you first. I'm quite new to the kind of investment and financial advice world. How would I go about finding a financial advisor who could help me make more ethical choices or steer me in that direction? You mentioned it being a good idea to look for a financial advisor that perhaps shared some values that we're looking to express through our investments. Do you have any information about that might help?
That's a great question, Sally. So there are lots of really good educational resources out there, and we've been doing through the Money Makes Change programme, trying to equip people with some of the questions that they might want to ask, and some of the ways of thinking through the values that they have and the kind of things that they want to be invested in. But as we said earlier, we don't offer financial advice. So for that, you would need to go to an independent financial advisor. And the good news is that there are lots out there that care about ethical investment, that are really experienced and knowledgeable, and can help you with that research, can ask you the right questions to help you express what you want to do with your money, and can make some suggestions to you. So the place that I would go to look, there's a directory run by UCSIF, which is the UK Sustainable Investment Network, UKSIF. If you go to the UCSIF directory, you can search for financial advisors, and you can filter that by geography, or where you are in the country, but also by the things that you're interested in. So that's a good place to start. If you are an ethical consumer subscriber, I know many of you may be, if not, you can pay a small subscription to sign up to Ethical Consumer for the year. They have lots of guides related to ethical finance, and they have some ethical finance and some independent financial advisors listed there, as well as the broader things around ethical investing and different funds that you might want to look at. So UCSIF and Ethical Consumer, and the website Good With Money is also somewhere that I would find helpful to go to. They have lots of guides, and they put regular kind of top 5, top 10 financial advisors, pension funds. They are particularly interested in sustainable investment. So again, that would be a really good place for you to look at.
Could I just butt in there very quickly? Those of you maybe who already have financial advisors, I would suggest this is a good time to sit down with them and ask them about ethical, social type funds. The world has changed in the last 5 years, certainly in that respect. So what was, as Rosie pointed out, a really niche little area 5 years ago has blossomed a lot. And your financial advisor should be able to talk to you sensibly on that. Even if they've never mentioned ethical funds before, this is a time to have a new chat, a new conversation with them.
I probably would add to that as well, that one thing to just be really conscious of when you're starting to explore ethical finance is the concept of greenwash or kind of ethical wash. So because the interest in ethical and sustainable investment is growing, it is, you will find that there are things that may look ethical on the surface, but once you do a bit of digging, you'll find that they aren't. So I think that's where some of these educational campaigns are really important, to help people get to grips with the jargon that exists around ethical finance and ESG. You'll see that term used quite a lot as well, ESG funds. So you do really need to, I guess, do your homework, but as we said, look for an independent financial advisor that shares your values and your outlook, that can really help you find your way through some of the challenges that there are out there.
Excellent, thank you both. And also just to share that we had a comment there from a member of our audience who mentioned that she personally had some good experience with ethical investors in Cheltenham. So another one to check out, ethicalinvestors.co.uk there. Thank you both very much. Probably also a good opportunity here to mention to people in terms of, as you said, about looking at ethical finance, engaging with financial advisors around that. Another event that takes place later on in the year. So obviously at the moment we're in the middle of Fairtrade Fortnight, which is celebrating all things fair trade. But there is a similar initiative that takes place in October every year called Good Money Week. And that's something that those of you watching who aren't familiar with that, you might want to check it out. This year it's running from the 3rd to the 7th of October. And Good Money Week aims to do for ethical investment, ethical finance, what Fairtrade Fortnight does for the fair trade movement. So very similar in their aims of promoting and raising awareness around ethical investment opportunities, and indeed a lot of the other ethical finance thoughts that Rosie mentioned in her presentation there around banking, investments, savings, whatever use of finance you may be looking to turn green, turn ethical. So that's certainly something that I would encourage you to keep an eye out for later on in the year as well. And indeed, both Shared Interest and ECCR get involved in Good Money Week, so it's something as well to keep an eye out maybe on our events pages to see what's happening around that time as well. So no, that's very helpful. Thank you, Rosie, and thank you, Mike, as well for the comments there. Just one other question, and this one directed to Ruth and Mike, in terms of shared interest and the opportunities there for churches or other groups to open accounts. Is that something that they can do?
Yeah, it is certainly something which is available. Churches, schools, businesses, faith communities, so any sort of community can open up an account still just from £100. I think you just need to have 4 people who will sign for the account, so that makes it nice and secure. And it's a really good way of putting a little bit of money very directly. I think the thing about shared interest is you're putting money directly. You're not dealing with shares, you're not dealing with things like that. You're actually dealing with people on the ground. And another important factor about it is that shared interest is not an organization that tells people what they want to do with their money. You really want to build a warehouse with your money. You want to do this. They are sitting there, people on the ground, farmers, producers are coming to them with what they need funds for. And if you look at the research says that directly giving money to people and empowering them with it is nearly one of the most effective things you can do. Rather than necessarily fund particular projects or have your own agenda. The basket weavers group, they know best what they need to produce baskets. I don't know. I'm very happy that Shared Interest are using my money to help people who are coming along and saying, this is something that will help us. How can you help me? So it's a very direct connection between money and actually something happening in a farm in Ghana. It's amazing.
Thank you. I think there's an expression, isn't there? Money makes the world go round, but I think really it's people that make the world go round, isn't it? And I think that's really important thing to remember. I think whether it be through buying fair trade products and what difference that makes, it can sometimes be challenging, I think, when we're shopping, making those decisions and wondering, well, what difference will this make? But I think certainly within the fair trade movement, we can see very clearly the difference that buying fair trade makes. And that can go right through to the choices that we make based on those same values that prompt us to buy fair trade products. Those values can be expressed in so many other ways and really do have a difference, do make a difference to people's lives. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Sally, that I think a lot of us shy away from having conversations about money and finance because we see it as very technical and quite an austere kind of topic. But really, I think if we can grasp that it's about relationships, all the transactions that we have are about relationships and about our connectedness with each other, I think we can bring that conversation kind of more into everyday life, and it not being about the experts who know about how the economy works or understand about the technicalities around investments, but actually it is a relational thing. If we can understand that the choices that we make with money have direct impacts on the world around us and on brothers and sisters around the world, I could think if we can understand a bit more about that relational element of money, then this is a movement that can grow. And it won't stay as a kind of a niche interest, will become something that we can recognise that we all have a part to play in.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's like the quote that you shared, Rosie, isn't it, in terms of the difference that we can all make. Absolutely. We've had a comment through or a question through that, not necessarily one to answer just now, but really a request, I suppose, for us to share some of these different websites in an email. Which we can certainly do. So Rosie, I'll follow up with you on that and make sure that we get all of those shared with people so that you can access all those different sites and explore those in your own time. That's not a problem. Just one last question that I've got here then. Obviously, I'll keep an eye on the Q&A in case any other questions do come through in the meantime. But Rosie, perhaps you wouldn't mind just talking to us a little bit about ethical pensions and what people can do if they want to find out more about that, what sort of conversations they might be looking to have, or if there's, again, any signposting that you're able to do to support people with that. Yeah,
of course. So I think this is an area, like I said, that it's not, we don't talk about pensions enough, but for people of all ages, many of us have a workplace pension, or perhaps we have a private pension if we're self-employed, and it is an area that we can explore to see what positive impact we can have. Depending on your situation will depend on what options are available to you. So if you have a workplace pension, then the first thing is to talk to your employer about that. If you're not sure about the details of your pension, obviously you can look through your paperwork, but also just talk to your employer about the pension options that are available to you. It's quite likely that there'll be an ethical fund that you can switch to. There certainly was when I came to ECCR. We talked about pensions in that first week that I was here, and I looked at our pension provider, and there was an ethical fund that I could switch to, and it was quite an easy thing to do. And obviously you would need to think about risks involved and your kind of financial planning, but it's often quite a simple exercise to switch to an ethical fund. That will probably be a fund that screens out what are seen as particularly negative investments. So you can look at what the criteria is and what your pension provider considers as an ethical fund. It may not go as far as you'd like it to go, but it may be a step in the right direction. If you're not sort of satisfied with your pension provider, obviously you can talk with your employer, or you can get together with others in your workplace and try and affect change that way, whether it's by engaging with the pension provider or considering whether there are alternatives. There are increasingly more green and sustainable ethical pensions out there. As I mentioned before, Good with Money is a good place to look at in terms of understanding a bit more about the mechanics of pensions and what you might need to look out for. And then Make My Money Matter, again, is a campaign that's trying to educate the general public really about the power of our pension, the money that's in our pensions, and how we really should take more interest in what that money is doing. So I think things are moving in the right direction with pensions. I think pension providers are increasingly wanting to make more positive decisions, wanting to engage with the companies that they invest in, more and more pension providers signing up to net zero commitments. So things are moving in the right direction, but I would really urge you, if you haven't looked at your pension recently, if it's not something that's talked about in your workplace very much, just to get together with others and to start to have those conversations. On the ECCR website, we have quite a simple introductory article that's it's a church newsletter article, but really you could share it in, anywhere really where you want to educate people a little bit more about pensions, and that might be a good place to start. But I think just start talking about it and look at your paperwork, put a date in your diary to say, all right, I'm going to investigate my paperwork. So often that is the barrier, is actually getting down and doing it and looking at the detail of where your money's invested.
Excellent, thank you, Rosie. That's great. That's prompted another couple of questions that have come through, both of which are for you, Rosie. I'll ask them together because your answer might incorporate information to both of them. So the first question: we understand how to invest in shared interest, and we've obviously seen, as Mike and Ruth have explained, a little bit about how people can do that if they're interested. How might someone invest, in inverted commas, in ECCR or make money makes changes work to encourage wider dissemination of your work and your messages? And then the second question, which is possibly connected, is what, in your experience, Rosie, is the best way for a church to engage with Money Makes Change?
Okay, yeah, so the first question, ECCR is a charity, so very much welcome donations from individual supporters and from churches to enable us to continue to do our work and to increase what we do. All our resources for individuals and churches we provide for free. So yeah, certainly welcome donations to enable that work. We also are looking for people to be advocates for us. So a little bit like Mike and Ruth do for shared interest. I would love for there to be more people in local communities and congregations talking about these issues. And this year we're launching a champions program where we're going to train and equip people to do that, to have those conversations about ethical finance or about tax justice, different ways in which we can see money used for a fairer, greener world. So if that's of interest to you, then do get in touch, because I think that's where we will see the movement grow, is by having more people in local communities talking about these issues. So 2 suggestions for you there. In terms of churches engaging with Money Makes Change, so I think, well, the first thing is to get in touch with me, because I really want to support more churches to have these kind of conversations and take practical action. So I'm there to be a resource to you. But if you want some very practical steps to take, I think first look at our ethical buying guide and do a bit of an analysis as a church as to your purchasing decisions, and maybe think about coming up with a purchasing policy that guides your decision making with the money that you spend. That would be a good kind of, I suppose, entry way into thinking about these issues. But also think about using our small group resources as well, because we have a small group workshop which you can use to have conversations about ethical finance, everything from banking to investments. We have Bible studies as well. See if you can weave it into the rhythm of your church. So whether that's in Lent or maybe in Good Money Week, maybe making that a particular point in the year when you start to engage others in your congregation. And I think that is where the powerful bit happens. So obviously it's important for a church to consider its own investments and banking and spending, but the real impact comes when people within that congregation and in the wider community start to make more positive decisions too, because that just multiplies the impact. So get in touch with us. I'm really happy to support, but also have a look at some of our resources and see where you might be able to weave that into your church's everyday life and teaching and discussions that you have, because there's lots of things that you can do.
Excellent. Thank you, Rosie. Mike, do you have some more comments to make?
Can I ask a question to Rosie?
Yeah, of course you can.
I'm just wondering whether you've had any input or are going to be having input into the business of the Church of England cathedrals all becoming charities. So they're in the middle of quite a big change, and becoming a charity is very significant, but there's also a lot of issues about your resources, your investments, your funds, and it might be a good time to sort of catch them and say, well, you're doing all this. Are you really, putting your money in the right place?
That's a great idea, Mike. I mean, I haven't been involved in those conversations, but I have had involvement with cathedrals that are wanting to think about where they use money, and what kind of framework they might have for their purchasing decisions, for example, or what, how they might go about switching to a different bank account. And a cathedral, obviously, you've got a lot more money talking about than you have in a small church congregation, but lots of the principles still apply. And I think that cathedrals can play quite a key role, quite a prophetic role, I think, in making sure that they align their values with the practices and the way that they use money. So absolutely a really important issue to raise.
Well, thank you, Mike, Ruth and Rosie. Just keeping one eye on the time, we'll draw things to a close there. There are no outstanding questions in our Q&A. I have shared in the chat some email addresses and contact details, both for Shared Interest and for ECCR. And we do have those coming up on the screen also for you in a moment as well. So do make a note of those. As was requested, we will also be in touch with a number of the different websites that have been mentioned during this session. As we said, we have recorded this session, so you can of course watch it back again. That will be likely being shared by Shared Interest, ECCR, and also hopefully on the Fairtrade Foundation's website as part of their on-demand section of their Fairtrade Fortnight Festival. So yes, thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you, Mike, Ruth and Rosie, for your presentations this afternoon. Thank you, our audience, for joining us. And if you are interested in joining any more events as part of Fairtrade Fortnight, then you can see there the link in front of you. Most of those events are taking place online. So there's a number of different things taking place in daytime, evening, weekend. So do take a look if you haven't already, and I'm sure you'll find something to enjoy there. So thank you again. We hope to hear from you again soon. Keep an eye out, as we said, for Good Money Week events, and indeed keep an eye on our respective websites for other events and opportunities that are coming up from our organisations. So thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to meeting you again sometime soon, whether virtually or in person.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.